Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander into one of the more curious corners of medieval life. Not the wars or the kings or the endless drafty castles, but something a little more mellow, something earthy. Tonight we're talking about how people in the Middle Ages got high. Really. Long before dispensaries, vape pens, or YouTube channels like this one, people were already experimenting with herbs, potions, fumes, and fermented concoctions to alter their state of mind. And while it might sound like a modern pastime, the truth is getting high is a very old hobby. One filled with spiritual quests, risky brews, some very questionable mushrooms, and more than a few monks staring at the wall in awe. We'll drift gently through sleepy monasteries, dusty apothecaries, and flickering candlelit huts as we uncover how the medieval mind embraced everything from mead and mandrake to incense and visions. And don't worry, this won't be a lecture. Just a soft, winding story meant to ease your mind and quiet your thoughts before bed. So grab your favorite pillow, settle under the blankets, and if you're listening from a chilly cabin in Vermont, a warm apartment in Chicago, or a cozy little room in New Zealand, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To start, let's picture a medieval herbalist's hut. The roof is thatched, the walls lean a little too much to one side, and the air inside smells like dried lavender, stale ale, and something pungent that you can't quite place. Shelves are lined with clay jars, some labeled, some not. There's a cat on the windowsill judging you. And in the corner, a mortar and pestle sit ready to grind the mysteries of the forest into powder. Now, despite the romantic image, being an herbalist in medieval Europe was a high-stakes job. You were part healer, part chemist, part wizard, and occasionally accused of being in league with the devil, especially if your mixtures made people feel funny. One of the most famous and frequently used plants was mandrake, a root that looked disturbingly like a little human body. People believed it screamed when pulled from the ground, and that scream could kill you if you heard it. Medieval logic was ... creative. But despite the eerie rumors, mandrake was prized. Small doses could relieve pain or act as a sedative. Larger doses? Well, let's just say people saw things. Some herbal texts recommended using mandrake as an anesthetic during surgery. Others just hinted with a wink that it might help you talk to angels, or see the future, or at least giggle for a few hours and forget your chores. The thing is, medieval folks didn't use the word high. They didn't even think in those terms. What we now describe as intoxication or euphoria, they often interpreted as spiritual experiences. A hallucination wasn't just a trick of the brain. It might be a vision sent from God, or a warning from a saint. Or, if things went badly, a sign of demonic possession. It really depended on the company you kept and whether the local priest liked you. And speaking of visions, we can't forget the incense-heavy mysticism of many monastic rituals. In large abbeys and cathedrals, clouds of frankincense and myrrh would rise during Mass, wafting around the heads of monks who'd been fasting for days. Combined with low blood sugar, chanting, and dim candlelight, it created a hazy, hypnotic state that left many convinced they'd touched the divine. One 14th century monk wrote of seeing flames dance along the pages of Scripture, though they did not burn. Another claimed he floated above the choir pit during Easter service. Of course, he might have just skipped dinner and breathed too deeply. But the line between religious ecstasy and recreational days wasn't always clear. Many mystics, especially women, fasted to the point of hallucination, reporting visions of saints, dragons, and disembodied hands offering advice. Was it devotion? Malnutrition? It's perhaps a bit of both. Scholars still debate whether these visions were purely spiritual, or a side effect of a very strange diet and a steady stream of burning herbs. Meanwhile, among peasants and farmers, the local brews told a different story. Mead, ale, and cider were staples, not just for fun, but for survival. Water was unreliable. Alcoholic drinks, even weak ones, were safer. And if they happened to lift your mood after a hard day of shoveling manure, well, that was just a bonus. Alewives, often women, brewed batches in cauldrons big enough to drown a small goat. Recipes were passed down with whispered warnings like, "Don't let it bubble more than 7 times or you'll see the devil." Some added herbs like henbane or sweet gale to make the drink more cheerful, a medieval euphemism if there ever was one. These additives could induce anything from light euphoria to wild visions of dancing skeletons and flying pigs. And the authorities? They weren't always thrilled. Some towns banned hedge ale, the rustic brews spiked with unknown herbs, for fear of encouraging public mischief or accidental flying. But in villages far from bishops and bailiffs, the rules were flexible. And then there were the wandering mystics, the green men of folklore, forest dwellers who lived off roots, berries, and occasionally something far more potent. They claimed to talk to trees, sing with birds, and sometimes after a particularly strong mushroom, become the moon itself. Whether they were wise hermits, or just cold, hungry men who ate the wrong fungus, that's a debate for another evening. One documented substance that appears often in medieval pharmacopoeias is henbane, a plant that, depending on the dose, could act as a pain reliever, sleep aid, or launch you straight into a conversation with your dead aunt. Used in witches' salves, it was often mixed with belladonna and wolfsbane and allegedly rubbed on broomsticks. And then, well, things got airborne. Here's a funny detail. Some of these flying ointments were applied, not where you'd expect. Let's just say it wasn't your elbows. Monks who confiscated the salves often burned them, claiming they contained Satan's breath. But in private, some may have taken notes. So yes, getting high in medieval times was real. It just didn't come with neon signs or rolling papers. It came wrapped in ritual, prayer, superstition, and homemade jars labeled use only under moonlight. And while some of it was medical, some spiritual, and some just for fun, the effects were often the same: strange dreams, long naps, and blurry tales nobody could quite explain the next morning. Let's stay a while longer in the smoky twilight of that medieval village, where the lines between medicine, magic, and merriment were as fuzzy as a monk's tonsure after a windy pilgrimage. If we're going to understand the full picture of medieval intoxication, we can't overlook the role of folk healers, those unofficial, often unlicensed practitioners who offered remedies ranging from soothing to suspicious. Picture an elderly woman in a moss-covered cottage at the edge of town. Locals might call her a wise woman, a midwife, or, if they were feeling dramatic, a witch. She knows which roots dull pain, which leaves ease fever, and which berries to avoid, unless you're hoping to spend the afternoon talking to your ancestors. People seek her out for all sorts of reasons: childbirth, toothaches, visions, and occasionally just to forget a hard winter or a cruel lord. One of her tools? Concoction made with nightshade? Yes, the deadly kind. But in tiny, careful amounts, it could dull pain, calm anxiety, or send someone on a very vivid trip through their own subconscious. There are stories, some serious, some whispered, half-ingested peasants who drank a cup of her brew and claimed to have danced with fairies in the woods all night, only to wake up in a puddle, missing one shoe and with their hair inexplicably braided. These stories weren't just bedtime tales. They shaped the way people thought about altered states of consciousness. In modern terms, we might call it a trip. Back then, it was more like a test, a mystical trial. Were you chosen? Cursed? Confused? It all depended on who you asked and how you behaved afterward. Meanwhile, in the higher echelons of society, court physicians and alchemists had their own ideas about mind-altering substances. Though their goal was often to cure rather than to create visions, the overlap was real. They experimented with minerals, exotic spices, and substances imported from the Islamic world. Some were curious about opium, known through trade routes from the East. Though rare and expensive, it occasionally made its way into medieval medicine chests. One particularly ambitious court healer in 13th century, Sicily is said to have given a sleeping potion made from poppy juice to a nobleman before a surgery. The man later reported dreaming of a golden lion whispering poetry, which either means it worked, or he was just very suggestible and slightly vain. But most nobles didn't need rare imports to relax. Their kitchens were filled with fortified wines, infused with herbs like wormwood or angelica both, of which had mild psychoactive effects when brewed correctly. Monks, too, often doubled as distillers. And while they may have started out trying to purify their souls, many ended up perfecting recipes for herbal liqueurs that would later evolve into things like Benedictine and Chartreuse. Drink enough of those, and even the most stoic friar might begin quoting the Psalms backwards. Interestingly, some of these religious beverages were initially intended for health. Strong infusion of herbs, after all, was thought to realign the humors. But in time, it became obvious that people weren't just drinking them for balance. They were drinking them because they made long prayers shorter and cold monasteries warmer. The word apothecary might sound formal, but in practice, these were often humble shops, with glass jars lining the walls, full of powders and pastes, each labeled in Latin and smelling faintly of cinnamon, licorice, and whatever got spilled last week. Customers came in coughing, limping, or weeping, and left with remedies that might contain valerian, hellebore, or mugwort. Some of these calmed the nerves, others prompted dreams so vivid, a few people refused to sleep ever again without them. There is a tale from 12th century France about a merchant who drank a mugwort tonic every night to avoid nightmares. But one evening, the dosage was off. He woke up on the cathedral steps, convinced he'd been speaking with Saint Denis. The local bishop declared it a miracle. His wife declared it nonsense. History, as always, shrugged and moved on. And then there were the pilgrims, those weary travelers who walked hundreds of miles to visit holy sites, often surviving on little more than stale bread, cheese, and faith. To ease their aching feet and troubled minds, they sometimes chewed betony or burned resinous herbs in their camps at night. These created mild euphoric effects, enough to dull pain and encourage the occasional vision of a glowing saint or, at least a glowing donkey. Some shrines even sold miraculous elixirs, usually wine spiked with something extra, meant to bless the soul and blur the senses. Were they genuine acts of devotion, or clever medieval marketing? Perhaps both. A particularly quirky practice emerged among some flagellant sects, groups who believed self-punishment could bring them closer to the divine. These individuals often traveled in groups, chanting, whipping themselves, and occasionally ingesting bitter herbs before entering trances. Witnesses described these sessions as both terrifying and weirdly mesmerizing, like watching a very painful group therapy session led by someone who thought pain was poetry. Historians still debate whether these trances were purely emotional or enhanced by substances. The prevailing theory? A bit of both. When you're fasting, chanting, and bleeding, even a weak tea made from wild lettuce can feel like a revelation. Among the stranger medieval recreational choices was ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. When consumed accidentally, it caused convulsions, hallucinations, and occasionally outbreaks of mass hysteria. Some speculate that certain episodes of witchcraft, panic, or dancing plagues were actually the result of bad bread. One moment you're making toast, the next you think the moon is chasing you with a frying pan. It's a humbling thought how closely the ordinary was tied to the otherworldly. A slice of rye, an herbal draft, a smoky chapel, and suddenly the veil between this world and another grew thin. Of course, not every altered state was welcome. The Church carefully distinguished between holy visions and suspicious ones. Saints who saw the Virgin Mary were venerated. Peasants who saw glowing rabbits were often accused of consorting with demons. The trick, it seemed, was knowing the right time to share your hallucination and who to share it with. So, if you were a medieval villager and felt like escaping your troubles for a little while, your options were both broader and riskier than you might expect. A strong ale, a stolen herb, a visit to the apothecary, just a particularly long prayer, and a smoky church, and you might find yourself drifting far from your little stone hut, floating gently into a world of dreams, doubts, and maybe just a hint of the divine. If your medieval journey took you deeper into the countryside, beyond the reach of cathedrals and courts, you'd soon find yourself in the world of hedge magic, where getting high wasn't called recreation, but communing with nature or seeking the second sight. In many remote villages, folk beliefs ran alongside Christian doctrine like two mismatched cartwheels wobbling in the same direction. Here, people believed the land itself could speak. You knew how to listen, and often that meant ingesting something that helped tune your ears to the whispering trees. Fly agaric mushrooms, those, red and white, toadstools that look like they belong in a fairy tale, were sometimes used in pre-Christian rituals and survived in fragmented folk traditions throughout parts of Northern Europe. These mushrooms didn't exactly cause euphoric highs. They caused disorientation, hallucinations, muscle twitches, and the overwhelming sense that something somewhere was watching you from behind a tree. Pleasant, not always. Memorable, it's very. Some theories suggest that the image of flying witches straddling brooms and soaring through the night might trace back to ointments made with these mushrooms in belladonna. The hallucinations could create a very vivid sense of weightlessness, flight, or transformation. Add in the suggestive shape of a broomstick, and well, medieval folk had quite the imagination. Of course, the Inquisition wasn't particularly fond of such flights of fancy. Anything involving altered states outside church control was suspect. If your visions included angels, and you were a monk, congratulations, you were holy. If your visions involved wolves that spoke Latin, and you were a peasant woman, you were dangerously close to becoming firewood. There's a recorded case from 1487 in Bavaria of a woman who claimed she could talk to the dead after applying a salve given to her by a traveling healer. The local priest promptly accused her of witchcraft. She defended herself by claiming the spirits only offered gardening tips. He was not amused. She was jailed, though later released when the magistrate admitted that his wife had also used the salve, but only for back pain. But let's leave the danger behind for a moment and return to more relaxing scenes. In warm Mediterranean climates, like Italy and southern France, wine wasn't just common, it was part of the daily diet. But what often gets overlooked is just how strong that wine could be, especially when aged in resin-coated barrels or flavored with herbs. A goblet of medieval red might hit harder than your average modern cocktail. And if the wine alone didn't do the trick, people often added spices and infusions. Mulled wine with nutmeg, cinnamon, and clove wasn't just a winter treat. It was believed to warm the body, stimulate the blood, and yes, bring on merry dreams. And the richer you were, the more spices you could afford, which meant a nobleman's post-feast nap might include visions of golden swans and celestial music, while a peasant's dream was more likely to involve an angry goose and a suspicious smell. A lesser-known favorite of the time was Hypocrassa spiced wine, often served warm and sometimes thickened with honey. It was associated with celebrations, remedies for melancholy, and occasionally aphrodisiac properties. One 15th century physician wrote that Hypocras cheereth the heart and looseneth the tongue, which is exactly the sort of thing someone says after drinking 2 cups too many and confessing their crush on the blacksmith's wife. Even more curious was the smoking of herbs, a practice far less documented than drinking or brewing, but not entirely unknown. Some scholars believe that bundles of dried herbs like sage, lavender, and mugwort were occasionally burned in private rituals or used as incense substitutes. And inhaling enough of these fumes in a small, unventilated space might produce more than just a nice smell. Mugwort, in particular, held a reputation for inducing vivid dreams. Some called it the dream herb. Others called it that weed that made Uncle Arnaud talk to the fireplace for 6 hours. Either way, it featured heavily in dream pillows, charms, and smoked bundles. In one Anglo-Saxon remedy book, mugwort is listed as the oldest of herbs, believed to have protective properties when worn or burned. Farmers sometimes tucked it into their boots before long treks. Others burned it before bed, hoping to see visions of the future. It didn't always work. One man in 1292 claimed to have dreamt of dancing pigs and a flying cheese wheel. His neighbors asked what it meant. He replied, "I think it means I'm hungry." Then there's hashish, which enters the medieval European imagination not through direct use, but via stories from the Islamic world. Crusaders and travelers returning from the East spoke in hushed tones about substances that could send men into ecstatic trances, make them immune to pain, or so they believed, and sometimes lead them to commit heroic or reckless acts. Though there's little evidence hashish was widely used in medieval Europe, the idea of it, the legend captured attention. Chroniclers wrote of the Assassins, a sect supposedly named for their use of hashish before missions. Whether this was truth or exotic exaggeration is still debated, but the myth lingered. A drug so powerful it could make you brave enough to leap off castle walls, or at least talk back to your father-in-law. Among sailors and long-distance traders, tales of exotic intoxicants were passed like treasure maps. There's mention in a 14th century travelogue of a merchant who tried a leaf in the Indies that made the mind wander and the tongue speak prophecy. He claimed he saw his own death, and then bought 3 more packets for the road. Closer to home, in the shadowy forests of Germany and Scandinavia, tales persisted of spirit brews, homemade infusions made from bark, berries, and fungi. Used in small doses, they were said to invite dreams, open the inner eye, or help someone find a lost object. Used in large doses, they were said to cause wolves to speak in riddles and frogs to recite poetry. Either way, results were mixed. In medieval Ireland, bards were known to use henbane and strong liquor before storytelling competitions. It was believed to loosen the gates of inspiration, though sometimes it just loosened the bladder. One bard, after a particularly inspired night, woke up in a sheep pen with a lute string wrapped around his neck and 3 verses tattooed on his own arm. He won the competition. The key to all these experiences, whether through herbs, wine, smoke, or story, was context. In medieval times, there was no strict line between medicine, mysticism, and getting a little lightheaded on a Wednesday. If your vision served a purpose, spiritual, poetic, or communal, it was valued. If it didn't, well, you'd better have a good explanation. So much of what we now consider getting high was then wrapped in symbolism and meaning. The effects might be the same as shift in perception, a softening of boundaries, but the interpretation could change everything. Was it enlightenment, possession, or poisoning you decided? Or more often, your priest did. And perhaps that's the strangest part of all. Not the herbs, or the dreams, or the midnight flights through smoky skies, but the fact that even then people sought escape. Not always from suffering, but sometimes from boredom, from routine, from the ordinary. And they reached for what they had: a root, a leaf, a drink, a dream. Let's pause now in a quieter place. A monastery tucked deep into the hills, far from the village, where the stone walls smell of damp parchment and boiled herbs. This is where the monks lived, men who had sworn off-worldly pleasures in pursuit of silence, order, and spiritual clarity. And yet, even here, among the chanting and candlelight, one could find some of the most fascinating and surprisingly potent experiments in mind-altering substances. Monks, after all, were among the few in medieval Europe with formal education, access to texts, and lots of time to copy, translate, and occasionally tweak ancient recipes. While most people were plowing fields or chasing goats, these brothers were carefully transcribing medical scrolls from Greek, Arabic, and Latin sources, many of which included curious mentions of sleep tonics, pain remedies, and herbs that caused gentle forgetfulness or lightened the burdens of thought. Take opium, for instance. It was known, though rare, and sometimes imported through Venice or Moorish Spain. Some monasteries, especially in southern Europe, kept it locked away, used not for pleasure, but to relieve unbearable suffering or to calm the mind before long vigils. It was said to smooth the edges of sorrow. But one can only wonder how often a lonely monk, reading the works of Galen or Avicenna by lamplight, might have tested a bit more than the prescribed dose. And then there's hyoscyamus, Niger better, known as henbane, common ingredient in many monastic herbals. The writings of Hildegard of Bingen, the famous 12th century abbess, make references to its use in treating melancholy and vexed spirits. She also warned of its dangers, writing that too much would draw the soul from the body for a time, leaving a person floating, unsure of earth or heaven. These descriptions hint at something more than a medical sedative. It described disassociation, hallucination, and perhaps even revelation. One monk, writing anonymously in a 14th century marginal note, described his experience after a black cup of St. Peter's rest. He wrote, "The stars grew close, and each word I read spoke back to me in golden voice." It's unclear whether the monk found this divine or terrifying or both. It wasn't just individual use that mattered. Entire rituals were designed to bring about altered states, though no one used those words. In some orders, long periods of fasting, chanting, and incense exposure were used to enter states of spiritual ecstasy. Combined with strong herbal brews, sometimes including valerian root, sweet flag, or even trace amounts of mandrake, these rituals blurred the line between religious devotion and something far more psychedelic. Historians still debate whether medieval monks truly sought these experiences or simply stumbled into them while trying to cleanse the body. Either way, visions were common. Dreams of angels, voices in the dark, brilliant lights flickering at the altar. To the faithful, these were miracles. To modern readers, They sometimes sound suspiciously like the after effects of a very strong cup of monastery tea. Back outside the walls, among the peasants and townsfolk, the line between religious experience and folk intoxication was thinner still. Seasonal festivals often served as excuses to drink, dance, and forget the daily grind. These celebrations were deeply tied to the rhythms of agriculture planting. Harvest solstices and often involved mead, ale, and plenty of strange concoctions brought out just for special days. At the spring festival of Beltane, villagers in parts of Britain and Ireland would light bonfires, drink from herbal brews made with blessed plants, leap over flames to chase away bad spirits or to impress a local sweetheart. The drinks at these events often included nettle, elderflower, or even psychoactive herbs like foxglove in dangerously low doses. One herbal mix from a 13th century English manor recipe book describes a jubilation draught brewed with honey thyme and a pinch of the eye-turning leaf, possibly referencing datura, a hallucinogenic plant known for causing wild visions and sudden fits of singing or screaming. The note ends with a helpful warning. Give no more than one ladle unless you seek the owl's wisdom. And if that doesn't sound strange enough, we can turn to the medieval Carnivola time when order was inverted. Fools became kings, and no one asked what was in the punch. Alewives and brewmasters competed to make the strongest, most memorable drinks. One chronicler wrote that a man drank 3 cups and began speaking in Greek, though he was born in Kent and never traveled. Of course, the church authorities occasionally tried to crack down on these festivities. Edicts were issued warning against devilish dances, drunken prophecy, and ungodly concoctions. But such warnings often went unheeded. After all, when winter was long, taxes were high, and your back hurt from threshing barley all week. A little divine madness once a season was practically medicinal. Let's not forget that entertainers, 2 jugglers, musicians, and traveling mummers often relied on chemical courage. A fiddler in the 14th century might warm up with spiced wine laced with wild lettuce before taking the stage. A jester might pop a seed or 2 of skullcap, thought to loosen the tongue and tickle the mind. Even puppeteers, those unsung masters of medieval merriment, were known to sip storyteller's syrup, likely a blend of ale and fermented honey with a whisper of thyme and sage. One anonymous performer left behind a curious verse in the margin of a French ballad. 1 sip for rhythm. 1 sip for rhyme. 1 sip to make the pig cart fly. No one knows exactly what he drank, but it seems he enjoyed the effects. In this strange and patchwork world, the idea of intoxication was never simple. It could mean divine vision if you were cloaked in robes and chanting in Latin, demonic possession. If you lived alone and had a garden full of suspicious plants, or joyful foolishness. If it was midsummer and your neighbor had just tapped a particularly spicy keg. The medieval mind didn't divide experiences the way we do now. There were no categories for recreational drug use, therapeutic use, or spiritual journey. There was only experience. Some helpful, some dangerous, some wondrous, and some best not spoken of during confession. And perhaps that's why these practices survived, quietly in the margins written into herbals. Whispered in kitchens, scribbled in the corners of manuscripts where monks dared not place their full names. Because the truth is, even in the sternest abbey or the most rustic village, people have always searched for that same thing, a way to slip the bonds of the ordinary, to feel just a little lighter, a little looser, to dream more vividly, or to laugh for no reason at all. And if that meant chewing on a bitter root, sipping a questionable brew, or burning herbs while staring into the hearth fire, well, they were willing to take the chance. As we drift deeper into the cobwebbed corners of medieval intoxication, it's time to look at the people who really knew how to walk the line between respected healing and suspicious sorcery. The apothecaries. These were the early pharmacists of the Middle Ages, part scientists, part mystic, part enthusiastic guesser. They weren't quite doctors, but they weren't simple merchants either. You'd find them tucked into narrow alleys in medieval towns. Their shops crammed with jars, powders, dried roots, and things in small cloth bundles that made a worrying squelch when touched. An apothecary's window might be filled with dried flowers, ground minerals, hanging herbs, and sometimes a stuffed bat or a jar labeled dragon's blood, which wasn't from a dragon at all, but rather a bright red resin from a tree. Need a remedy for heartbreak? They had something. Bad back. Absolutely. Night terrors involving spectral goats? Not a problem there, was probably a bitter tea for that. Among their most requested items were soporific sponges, cloths soaked in herbal infusions, dried, then rehydrated and inhaled to induce sleep, or, depending on the recipe, a dream state bordering on visionary. Common ingredients included mandrake, henbane, opium poppy, and occasionally cannabis, known in some texts as the laughing herb. Cannabis wasn't tea, especially popular in most of Europe. It lacked the religious or mystical framing of mandrake or henbane, but it did appear in several 14th century medical recipes. Typically in sevs or oils. The effect was considered mild but comforting. One manuscript suggests rubbing it on the soles of the feet to quieten the restless soul, a poetic way of describing a relaxed nap. But not all recipes were so gentle. One German apothecary's 15th century notebook lists a preparation called Angel's Draught, combining clove, honey, nutmeg, cinnamon, valerian, and a touch of the moon-sleeping root. The margin simply reads, "Use in small cups. Too much, and the angels will speak too loudly." Of course, the regulation of such shops was nearly non-existent. Recipes varied wildly, dosages were a matter of experience and hope, and side effects ranged from a mild giggle to a 3-day trance. One unlucky tanner reportedly took a clarity syrup meant to sharpen memory and instead wandered into the cathedral, removed his boots, and claimed he was married to St. Barbara. Even the church, which often frowned on folk remedies, kept quiet when apothecaries supplied monasteries or noble houses. It wasn't until someone saw visions without proper theological credentials that authorities got involved. Seeing angels? Finith, you were a nun. Seeing talking chickens that raised questions? Then there were the dream books, medieval manuals filled with instructions for receiving visions or deciphering prophetic dreams. While some were simple, like sleeping with a sacred relic under your pillow, others included ingesting special herbal mixtures. One Anglo-Norman text offers this gem: mix betony, mugwort, and parsley root with wine. Drink on the 3rd night of the waxing moon while reciting Psalm 23. Sleep in linen, blessed by a widow. Did it work? Hard to say. But one would be hard-pressed to doubt that something interesting happened after drinking herbal wine and sleeping under widow linen. By the late Middle Ages, alchemy had begun to influence these traditions, particularly in Italy and France. The alchemists were indeed just obsessed with turning lead into gold. They wanted to transform the body and spirit. They believed that the right combinations of minerals, herbs, and spiritual intent could purify the soul, or at least make a very shiny powder. One famous alchemist, Arnaldus of Villanova, wrote about elixirs that brighten the intellect and soften the walls of perception. His recipes often included gold leaf, rosemary, and occasionally wine infused with crushed emerald. Meanwhile, among the general population, simpler combinations persisted. Farmers chewed licorice root to soothe the nerves. Shepherds smoked dried colt's foot for coughs, but found it made the world hum a little. And soldiers, especially after battle, were known to drink strong concoctions of wormwood, vinegar, and ale to ease both pain and memory. One knight wrote after the Battle of Agincourt that he took the green bitter draught, then watched the stars dance above his tent like banners in the wind. He considered it a vision from heaven. His squire considered it fermented mold. Either way, it helped him sleep. And that's perhaps the most important thread running through all of this. Sleep, a world of brutal labor, poor hygiene, constant illness, and freezing nights. Sleep was precious. The line between getting high and finally resting was incredibly thin. People didn't take herbs to party. They took them to escape toothaches, aching joints, grief, and bad dreams. Getting lightheaded might be a side effect, but sleep, that was the goal. Blessed, merciful sleep. You see, in a medieval world filled with noise church bells, coughing neighbors, chickens that never seemed to sleep, anything that calmed the mind was sacred. Whether that meant a warm brew, a whispered prayer, or a leaf tucked into a pillow, people reached for relief in whatever form they could find. And sometimes, that relief meant stepping sideways from reality, just for a while. Just long enough to feel soft, to feel safe, to forget. There's an odd comfort in knowing that even centuries ago, people struggled with restless minds, sleepless nights, and a craving for peace, and that they, like us, turn to rituals, routines, and the occasional questionable beverage to find it. So, if you've ever lit a candle, brewed chamomile, or put on a sleepy podcast to calm your thoughts, you're in very old, very human company. As the Middle Ages gave way to the early Renaissance, the line between medicine, mysticism, and experimentation with altered states didn't fade, it merely shifted. New ideas were blooming, and with them came a renewed interest in the inner workings of the human body and mind. But even as scholars debated the four humors and the seat of the soul, ordinary people continued their aguiled search for something to take the edge off, something to help them sleep, forget, or simply float for a little while. Let's wander now into the manor kitchens of late medieval Europe. Here among the copper pots and fire-roasted meats, you'd find more than just recipes for pies and pottages. You'd also find tonics, syrups, and cordials, which were sweetened herbal infusions meant to strengthen the heart. That phrase, like many medieval terms, had a double meaning. Strengthen the heart could mean help with palpitations, or it could mean help with heartbreak or anxiety, or that vague, unnameable ache that settles in the chest when the world feels too heavy. A common recipe for a comfort cordial included rose petals, lemon balm, and a bit of brandy. Some versions added nutmeg or mace, both imported spices with mild psychoactive qualities. Served warm in the evening, it was said to promote calmness, open the chest, and bring about pleasant fancies. It may not have induced true intoxication, but it offered that lovely, floaty middle ground, what one 15th century cook called a fog of kindness. In wealthier households, there was also access to imported sugar, which wasn't just a sweetener, but a medicine in itself. Apothecaries made sugar pills filled with herbs and spices, meant to treat melancholy, insomnia, and disturbance of the spirits. These were expensive, but quite popular, especially among ladies of the court, who might nibble a lozenge laced with valerian and clove before bed. One diary from a noblewoman in Burgundy notes, 2 sugar pearls before sleep, dreamt of my childhood garden, woke in peace. And then there, the curious case of ambergris, waxy substance found in the digestive tracts of sperm whales. It was rare and costly, but it had a surprisingly long-standing reputation as a mood lifter and aphrodisiac. Some added it to wine. Others simply inhaled it from silk sachets. What effect did it actually have? Hard to say, maybe none. But the belief in its power combined with its oceanic musk and the luxury of possessing such a rare item might have been intoxicating enough. Meanwhile, in the universities and budding medical schools of Europe, scholars were arguing about all this, not whether people got high. Everyone knew that, but what it meant. Was intoxication a failure of the soul's anchor, a misfiring of the humors, or simply the natural byproduct of certain substances found in nature, meant to be used with care? One Parisian scholar, writing in 1389, claimed that dreams induced by poppy and wormwood may carry truth, if the body be pure and the moon rightly angled. Another warned that too much sage tea makes the tongue bold, but the judgment poor. That sounds like something a professor says right before spilling his notes into the fire. These debates weren't just academic. It affected how healers treated patients and how authorities treated those caught experimenting too freely. While monks and nobles had some leeway, peasants and outsiders were often punished for using the same substances. It's a double standard that endured well into the modern age. Let's take a moment now to revisit the concept of dreaming, because for medieval people, dreaming wasn't idle nonsense. It was a deeply spiritual act. Dreams were messages either from the divine, from the body's imbalance, or, occasionally, from mischievous spirits. There were entire books devoted to interpreting dreams, like the Somniel Danielis, which was essentially a medieval dream dictionary. And so, substances that helped one dream more vividly were treated with respect and a bit of fear. A person who dreamed too often might be seen as open in a dangerous way. A person who never dreamed might be spiritually stunted, and someone who claimed to control their dreams, well, that person was either a mystic or a liar. One of the gentler dream aids was lettuce, not the kind you toss into a salad, but wild lettuce, which contains lacticarium, a compound with mild sedative effects. Some people steeped the leaves into a tea, others dried and smoked it, often blending it with lavender or chamomile. It was called poor man's opium, though it lacked the same punch. Still, for a tired shepherd or aching grandmother, it was enough. One chronicle from Wales describes a village woman who brewed a bedtime blend of lettuce, sage and milk, claiming it gave her the quiet dreams of angels folding laundry. That may be the gentlest hallucination in recorded history. And speaking of recorded histories, the marginalia, those scribbles in the corners of medieval manuscripts, are some of our best sources for this quiet, dreamy side of the past. In these margins, monks doodled snails fighting knights, cats playing harps, and once a man drinking from a goblet while floating upside down. Was it imagination? Was it memory? Or just what happens when you stare at the same illuminated letter G for 7 hours while sipping St. Hildegard's restful brew?
Else.
Sometimes even the scholars gave in. In a late 14th century manuscript, a tired monk adds this note beneath a complex Latin passage. I have read this thrice, yet it reads me back. I fear the herbs in my bread were too generous. So much of medieval life was lived close to nature, and nature, in return, offered both nourishment and mystery. A plant could be food, medicine, or poisoned, depending on how it was prepared, when it was picked, and whether you trusted the person who gave it to you. This uncertainty created space for caution, but also for experimentation. People were curious, not always careful, but curious. And while their language didn't include terms like psychoactive or euphoria, their experiences were real, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrifying, often oddly familiar. Because even today we recognize that feeling the need to escape for a while, to float above the noise, to dream, to pause. In the quiet corners of the medieval world, people found ways to do just that. With a leaf, a root, a whisper, and a bit of moonlight. Let us take a slow breath and ease ourselves toward one of the most quietly fascinating aspects of medieval life, the rituals of rest. Because if we're talking about getting high, drifting off, dreaming strange dreams, altering one's state of mind, then we must eventually return to the warm embrace of sleep, the ultimate daily escape. For most people in the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just a biological necessity. It was sacred, mysterious, and often broken into two parts. What scholars now call segmented sleep. People would drift off shortly after sunset, wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night, then fall back asleep until dawn. And what they did during that quiet intermission? Well, some prayed, some pondered dreams, and others ... brewed tea. Yes, tea. Not the kind you'd find in modern tea bags, but gentle, steaming infusions of herbs steeped slowly over embers in ceramic pots. These infusions were both cultural and deeply personal. Recipes passed down through families, each tailored to the sleeper's unique worries. Some drank linden flower tea, known to calm the nerves. Others favored chamomile or vervain, which was said to soften the soul. And in more daring households, a pinch of skullcap or valerian root might find its way into the pot just enough to call down the stars. There are even whispered records of households burning herbs, like angelica or frankincense in the hearth overnight. Not for perfume, but to cleanse the dream path. A wonderfully strange idea, the notion that dreams traveled like pilgrims, and your bedroom needed to be ready to receive them. Monks, too, had nighttime routines. In the silence of their cells, many would write down their dreams in tiny, careful script. Some believed dreams were tests of the spirit. Others believed they were messages-coded advice from the saints, or warnings from beyond. Either way, dreams mattered. And whatever helped bring them on herbs, chants, or even the faint sound of dripping water was valued. One text from a monastery in northern Italy describes a dream pillow made from hops, lavender, and thyme, stitched into linen and placed beneath the head. The monk wrote, "It softened my mind, and in that softness I saw my mother, though she was gone these 10 winters." Isn't it strange and strangely lovely that even in the age of plagues, crusades, and endless toil, someone took the time to gather herbs, sew them into a pillow, and hope for a peaceful night? But while many sought dreams, others feared them. In some regions, vivid or disturbing dreams were believed to be caused by night spirits, or the infamous old hag, a creature who would sit on your chest and steal your breath while you slept. Today we call this sleep paralysis, but in the Middle Ages it was terrifying, and remedies varied widely. To ward off these nighttime intrusions, people hung iron keys above the bed or tucked rowan berries under the mattress. Some placed small cups of salt on the windowsill, and a few went further, placing protective herbs like St. John's wort near the bed or burning juniper smoke through the rafters. And what if you wanted not just to sleep, but to see something? To dream of lost loved ones, divine visions, or your future husband's face? There were rituals for that too. One popular method involved placing a slice of bread and honey under the pillow. The sweetness was said to invite honest dreams. Another tradition recommended placing a silver coin beneath your tongue and sleeping with your feet pointing north, though it's unclear how many people could do that without kicking their spouse. And then there were the more experimental dreamers. A group of mystics in southern France believed that certain stones, when placed in water and drunk beneath the full moon, could open the eye behind the eye. Their favorite? Amethyst, believed to guard against drunkenness and promote clear spiritual dreaming. Though modern gemologists might disagree, it certainly made for poetic nights. These gentle practices existed alongside the more dangerous ones. Some people, especially those with deeper pockets or access to imported texts, experimented with alchemical sleep tonics. These brews often combined herbs like mandrake, opium poppy, and saffron, stirred into warm wine or goat's milk. The goal wasn't just sleep, it was a guided vision. The dreamer would be given a symbol to focus on: a rose, a ladder, a bird, and told to look for it in their dreams. If it appeared, it was a sign. If it spoke, well, that was a revelation. There's one curious record of a noblewoman who saw the same red fox every time she drank a dream cordial made by her chaplain. The fox would sit at the end of her bed and stare at her. She eventually wrote to a bishop for advice. His reply: do not feed it. Some dreams were light, others strange. Some were shared. Yes, shared dreams. A few households practiced paired dreaming, where two people would drink the same herbal brew, lie side by side, and hope to enter the same dream landscape. Did it work? Possibly not. But people claimed it did. One carpenter and his wife claimed they met each other inside a dream forest, climbed a silver ladder, and sang to the moon.
Oh.
Their neighbors were skeptical. The couple, however, began planting moonflowers along their fence and wouldn't say why. And then, as now, there were the skeptics. A tax collector in York kept a meticulous dream diary, trying to prove that dreams were simply the product of indigestion. He drank strange teas, chewed dried eel before bed, and once slept with his feet in cold water. His conclusion? Dreams are but echoes of cheese and guilt. And maybe he was right. Or maybe he needed a better tea. Because whether you believed dreams were divine, herbal, or dietary in origin, they mattered. They softened the edges of reality. They gave people something to wonder about in a world filled with hard work, cold floors, and unpredictable kings. And the fact that people went to such lengths, brewing, steeping, smoking, chanting, whispering, even risking arrest just to sleep a little deeper or dream a little brighter, well, that's a kind of quiet rebellion. A way of saying, I want more than what the daylight gives me. It's a reminder that long before sleep aids, sedatives, or soothing playlists, people still found their way into altered states. Through plants, through prayer, through the hope of meeting a red fox who might explain the meaning of life. Let us turn now to one of the more overlooked yet oddly charming sources of medieval altered states: music. Not something smoked or sipped, but something heard, something felt in the bones on a quiet night, or in the middle of a slow, echoing cathedral. In a time when entertainment was scarce and silence often stretched on for hours, music had a powerful, almost hypnotic effect. Chanting, especially in religious settings, was more than performance. It was transportive. And some listeners, particularly during long evening services, reported sensations that sound suspiciously like mild trances. Picture it: a monk in a shadowed chapel, singing Gregorian chants in a voice so slow and low it vibrates in your chest. The flickering candlelight, the rhythmic drone, the incense wafting through the air. It wasn't meant to intoxicate, but it might have anyway. Some mystics claimed that music was the ladder to God. One abbess in the 13th century described entering a sound vision, where each note was a step, and the harmonies carried her through curtains of blue air. Whether that was a metaphor, or the result of fasting plus candle smoke, is up for debate. But not all musical highs were spiritual. In villages, during festivals or harvest feasts, music served another purpose: to loosen the limbs and lift the mood. Drums, flutes, bagpipes, these weren't refined instruments. They were loud, repetitive, and perfect for dancing. And with enough ale or herb wine that dancing could turn into something wild. Not wild like today, S-clubs more like spinning barefoot around a fire until the stars begin to blur. There are records of people collapsing mid-dance, claiming to see faces in the smoke, or angels laughing in the treetops. Some historians believe these were exaggerated tales, or simply the result of dehydration. Others point to the inclusion of hallucinogenic herbs in the celebratory drinks. Either way, music played a part. The rhythm, the repetition, the shared heat of bodies moving in sync brought people somewhere else, somewhere softer. And if music could do that in the open, imagine what it did in the closed, quiet spaces of the mind. There's a curious letter from a bishop in 1408 who wrote, "The widow of Branlet claims she now speaks with her husband nightly, thanks to the psalter I lent her. She sings, and he answers. I fear she has either found comfort or begun to lose her grip. We'll never know which. Beyond music, let's wander now into the world of medieval perfumery, because the sense of smell played a surprisingly large role in inducing altered states. Medieval physicians believed in aromatic therapy, though they wouldn't have used that phrase. Certain scents were said to lift the spirits, calm the heart, or awaken the senses. This wasn't just about smelling nice. It was medicinal, spiritual, and sometimes downright trippy. One of the most potent substances was myrrh, burned in churches and private rituals alike. Combined with frankincense, it created thick, heady smoke that clung to robes and beards for days. People would come out of Mass feeling lightheaded, floaty, or vaguely euphoric. And then there was rose oil, believed to soothe sorrow, and jasmine, which was said to quicken dreams. Wealthier households even infused their linens with these scents, believing they could induce better sleep or more vivid visions. One noblewoman kept a pouch of dried orris root under her pillow, claiming it gave her dreams of velvet boats and stars that whispered. Whether that's poetic nonsense or the world's first fragrance review, we'll never know. But what we do know is that these rituals of scent mattered. A time without soap, without air fresheners, without clean clothes most days. A sudden burst of lavender or cinnamon could feel like magic. And if it happened during a prayer, a bath, or a moment of grief, that scent might anchor itself to something much deeper. Then, of course, we must mention the role of baths, rare luxuries, but deeply cherished. When available, they were often infused with herbs, mint, sage, thyme, and occasionally more exotic ingredients like musk or ambergris. The warm water, the dim light, the scent of oils all combined to create a rare kind of peace. One English lord reportedly soaked in a bath of violets and marjoram every new moon, saying it cleared the phlegm from my heart and put dreams behind my eyes. And finally, there were the rituals of silence. We often forget that in the Middle Ages, silence was not just absence of sound, it was a practice. Monasteries held hours of intentional quiet. So did some households after sunset. No talking, no music, just the creak of wood and the wind. In that silence, many people meditated not in the modern yoga mat sense, but by slowly reciting psalms, or staring at the hearth, or simply listening to their own breath. This could induce light trance states, especially when combined with rhythmic movement, like spinning wool or kneading bread. There's something deeply human about that. The idea that repetition, quiet, and gentle scent could bring you somewhere else, somewhere still. One pilgrim wrote in his journal, I stirred my lentils and saw Jerusalem. Maybe he meant that metaphorically. Or maybe he'd just been on the road too long, sleeping in too many haylofts with too little ale. But the truth is, not all medieval altered states came from plants. Some came from rhythm, from warmth, from scent, from silence. They came from the daily rituals, small acts that softened reality just enough to make it bearable. Stirring a pot, chanting a line, laying your head on a lavender-scented cloth and breathing in the quiet. Because the medieval world wasn't always a loud, brutal place. Sometimes it was gentle, sleepy, intimate, filled with hush and hum and heat. And in that softness, people found escape not dramatic, not dangerous, just floaty, just enough to drift a little and return. Now, let us open the creaky wooden door of a humble medieval home, just a one-room cottage tucked into the bend of a muddy path. A fire crackles low in the hearth. Children breathe deeply beneath woolen blankets. The animals in the corner settle into straw. And at the center of it all, an old woman stirs a clay pot, her back turned to the chill, her hands steady with knowledge passed down across generations. Tonight, she's making a sleep draft not from a written recipe, but from memory. A handful of mallow root, a pinch of pennyroyal, 3 dried rose hips, and a curl of orange peel, saved from last summer's feast. She doesn't call it medicine, she just calls it the bedtime mix. When it's done, she pour a ladle into a cup, add a spoon of honey, and pass it to her husband, who grumbles about dreams but drinks it anyway. And maybe he'll sleep without his usual tossing. These little moments were everywhere. They weren't written down in grand books. They didn't involve monks or nobles. But they were real. They were quiet. They were the domestic heart of medieval life. It's because getting higher, getting soft, or light, or warm wasn't always about visions or angels. Sometimes it was just about relief. Relief from the pain of labor. Relief from the anxiety of another bad harvest. Relief from the grief of losing a child, or a brother, or the use of your legs. And in those moments, people turned to what they had: the earth, the fire, each other. We like to imagine the past in grand strokes, battles and plagues, kings and crusades. But the real texture of history lies in the ordinary evenings. In the way someone lit a candle, in the way someone hummed the same song while grinding herbs in the dark. And perhaps nowhere is that more evident than in the history of home remedies. Let us talk about one of the more charming and possibly effective rituals for easing the mind: the herbal sachet. These were small bundles of cloth filled with dried herbs, worn around the neck, tucked under pillows, or placed in bedclothes. Common ingredients included lavender, lemon balm, rosemary, and meadowsweet hull. With calming or aromatic properties, children might sleep with them to ward off nightmares. Adults wore them to ease sorrow. Lovers exchanged them in secret, stitched with ribbon. A particularly lovely example survives from 15th century France. A pillow sachet for gentle sleep, made with dried chamomile, rose petals, and mint, stitched inside linen and warmed before bed. The maker noted it reminds the heart of May. Was it intoxicating? Not in the modern sense. But if your room smelled like summer, your pillow warm and soft, and your head full of tender scent, who's to say you weren't gently transported? Even the colors of herbs mattered. Blue flowers were calming, yellow ones lifted the mood. White roots like valerian were considered cooling to the mind. These ideas weren't strictly chemical, they were symbolic, spiritual, even intuitive. In fact, many of the most common getting high methods in the medieval world had less to do with strong substances and more to do with shifting the senses gently. A warm cup, a flickering flame, a fragrant pillow. A song repeated until it becomes something more than words. And here perhaps lies the secret. The medieval world didn't always need intense chemicals to achieve altered states. It needed space, space for slowness, space for repetition, space for the soul to stretch. A shepherd might stare at the stars long enough to see patterns move. A weaver might slip into a trance after threading for hours. A tired mother might forget her grief just long enough to smell rosemary and remember a summer long gone. We could call these hallucinations. We could call them coping mechanisms. Or maybe, just maybe, they were something sacred. Because even if the methods were crude dried leaves, smoky hearths, boiled roots, the intention was clear. People wanted more than survival, they wanted peace. There's a 14th century poem written by a widower in York. He speaks of his wife's passing, his loneliness, and how he cannot sleep. But then he writes, "I brewed her tea of apple leaf and lime, and drank it in her gown, still holding form. She came to me that night, not as ghost, but as breeze, and I, poor man, wept into the smell of time." It's heartbreaking and beautiful, and it tells us everything. That getting high in medieval times wasn't always about escape. Sometimes it was about connection, to the past, to the land, something lost or longed for. And in that connection, even in grief, there was relief. A moment of softness in a world of hard stone. A glimmer of light in a long, candlelit night, a breath, a dream, a bit of laughter stirred into a bitter brew, and now we've wandered through smoky chapels and herb-filled kitchens, danced around festival fires, and peered into the quiet rituals of monks and mothers alike. And still, there is one more peculiar path to explore, the blurred boundary between getting high and divination, that old human desire to see beyond the veil. Because in the medieval mind, to be altered mentally, emotionally, spiritually, was not only a possibility, but often a doorway, a key, a way to receive messages, not just to dream, but to know. One of the most striking examples comes from the tradition of scrying, the practice of gazing into reflective surfaces to see visions. This wasn't some fringe hobby. Kings, queens, bishops, and peasants alike took part in this ancient art. A basin of water, a polished stone, a bit of oil smeared across a piece of glass. The tools were humble. The results, it's wild. There are records of herb-assisted scrying sessions, especially among folk healers and cunning women. One 15th century English guide suggests rubbing the eyes with an infusion of eyebright, fennel and betony, then staring into a bowl of still water under moonlight while repeating a psalm. Some claim to see faces, others saw symbols. And one unfortunate man said he saw a goose carrying a candle, whispering secrets. He told this to a monk who told him never to repeat it again. There's a kind of tender absurdity in these tales, not because they're silly, but because they show how deeply people yearn to see something more, something beyond crops and coins and coughs. And for many, the altered states brought on by rituals, herbs, or deprivation were exactly how they got there. Take fasting, for example. It wasn't just spiritual discipline, it was a key to vision. Without food, the body grew light, the senses more acute, the mind loose and wobbly. Add a bit of candlelight and chanting, and it's no wonder people started hearing saints or seeing halos around their cat. But consider pilgrimage, which wasn't just a journey, it was an ordeal. Exhaustion, exposure, poor food, and endless repetition of prayer could bring about experiences that feel suspiciously like modern descriptions of psychedelic trips. One pilgrim wrote, "I walked until the dust coated my tongue. I sang the Ave Maria until I forgot my own name. Then the trees moved aside and showed me my Father's smile. Whether that's divine, delusional, or the result of heat stroke is beside the point. What matters is how real it felt. And that's the key. These altered states, whether induced by herbs, hunger, scent, sound, or solitude, weren't frivolous. They were meaningful. Not everyone sought them, not everyone welcomed them, but those who did believed they were brushing against truth." Now let's return for a moment to the wilder fringes of medieval belief. The Greenwood mystics, often solitary figures who lived in forests, caves, or abandoned chapels, had their own blend of spiritual practice and herbal lore. Some used plants like datura, hemlock, or fly agaric, not recklessly, but reverently. Their goal wasn't to get high, it was to get closer. Closer to nature, to the divine, to the strange harmony beneath the ordinary world. One of these figures, a man called Thomas the Quiet, reportedly drank a daily tea of nettle, sage, and a trace of belladonna. He spoke little, painted visions on bark, and claimed to receive instructions from a silver hand. In his dreams, local villagers both feared and fed him. When he died, they buried him beneath an oak and said the birds sang differently that day. It's impossible to separate fact from fable, but perhaps we shouldn't try. Because in medieval times, the line between history and vision was always soft. Even in medicine, this softness remained. Physicians diagnose illnesses of the soul as seriously as those of the stomach. A person who laughed too much might be said to have an excess of yellow bile. A person who wept by candlelight was under the influence of the moon. And for all their errors, they understood something we often forget: that the mind and body are not separate, that pain can twist dreams, that longing can bloom into hallucination, that herbs can heal a wound, or soften a memory, or open the door to a world we didn't know we were missing. Which brings us at last to a strange little truth. Most people in the Middle Ages didn't think of getting high. As we do, they weren't chasing a buzz. They were chasing meaning, or peace, or just a break from the weight of being alive in a world where everything was fragile. And whether that came from a sip of sleep wine, a chant echoed in stone, or a burning sprig of mugwort, they took it. Not always safely, not always wisely, but always humanly. And perhaps on some quiet nights, under stars that looked the same then as they do now, they felt what we feel. That soft exhale, that brief stillness, that flicker of something deeper. And they slept. As we begin our slow descent into the final chapters of this sleepy tale, let us pause among the forgotten corners of medieval life, the spaces in between history. Grand events where real people quietly shaped their days. Because sometimes, the most revealing clues about how people altered their states of mind come not from medical texts or mystical treatises, but from lullabies. Yes, lullabies. Soft, repetitive songs sung to children at bedtime, passed from mouth to mouth, not through books, but through tired breath. These little melodies often included references to dreams, to nighttime animals, and occasionally to sleeping herbs. Some mothers in medieval England sang of lavender and poppies. In Italy, songs mentioned fennel tea and rosemary tucked under pillows. And in parts of Scandinavia, lullabies warned children to stay under the covers, lest the wind spirits steal their breath. Were these just superstitions? Maybe. Or maybe they were gentle ways to acknowledge the unseen, those altered states of mind that flicker at the edge of sleep. Because the medieval world was never silent. It was always humming with prayer, with stories, with quiet rituals whispered in kitchens and sung over cradles. And speaking of whispers, we must also acknowledge the role of secret knowledge, the kind passed between midwives. Herbalists, wandering peddlers, and occasionally scribes too curious for their own good. These folk often knew more than they let on. They carried recipes for teas that made children sleep, oils that soothed sorrow, powders that blurred grief. A widow in Cornwall might know that steeping poppy petals in goat's milk eased nightmares. A shepherd in the Alps might chew angelica root during storms to feel less alone. This wasn't wizardry. It was intuition sharpened by generations of survival. And still today, we find scraps of these recipes, tucked in the margins of books, scribbled on scraps of vellum, hidden in the folds of old household ledgers. For anxious minds, steep sage in time under the waxing moon. To forget sorrow, sip honeyed hops before rest. A pinch of marjoram eases the burden of silence. These phrases weren't precise. They didn't measure in grams or milliliters. They speak to something deeper. A world where people believed that plants had personalities, that sleep had texture, that dreams could be invited like guests. One particularly curious belief recorded in a Welsh farm book was that if you placed a mint leaf under your tongue and repeated a loved one's name 12 times, you'd dream of them. The farmer's wife claimed it worked for 5 nights in a row. Farmer claimed it only worked when he used the name of his first love. That conversation, sadly, was not recorded. And what of the night workers? The people who tended fires, stood guard, or watched the sick? These souls often lived between waking and sleeping, between light and dark, to stay alerter. Ease the chill, they too had their concoctions. Some chewed juniper berries, said to sting the tongue and quicken the pulse. Others drank weak ale, warmed with ginger or cardamom, both imported spices with surprising heat. But occasionally they overindulged. And one can imagine a watchman seeing strange shapes in the mist, or hearing voices in the wind not from spirits, but from his own weary, herbal-fogged mind. These stories remind us. Not all altered states were intentional. Some came upon people like weather drifting in, through illness, grief, fatigue, or a badly brewed tonic. And yet people adapted. They wrapped their experiences in meaning. If a dream was too strange, they turned it into a parable. If a vision was frightening, they added it to the family storybook. If an herb went too far, they blamed the moon. And isn't that something? That long before neuroscience, before psychology, before sleep studies and serotonin levels, people still respected the mystery of the mind. They didn't always understand it, but they knew it mattered. And in a world where books were rare, where every candle mattered, where winter could steal your breath and summer your crops, the smallest comfort was precious. So they whispered their recipes. They sang their sleepy songs. They wrote their strange dreams into the margins of books and dared not erase them. And in those margins, in the soft spaces between ink and parchment, we can still feel them. Still brewing, still hoping, still drifting, towards some unknown but familiar place. Let us drift now into the final twilight of this medieval journey, where the lines between fact and folklore fade like embers in a hearth. For even as the Middle Ages inched toward modernity, the practice of using herbs, rituals, and gentle intoxication to shift perception never quite disappeared. It simply changed costume. In the cities, apothecaries became more official, their shops more polished, the remedies measured with a touch more precision. But step behind the counter, and you'd still find jars labeled in Latin, filled with powdered roots and crumbling petals that whispered of older, earthier knowledge. One 16th century Italian apothecary kept a locked cabinet labeled Somnia Dreams. Inside were mixtures of saffron, violet, opium, and crushed pearl, expensive, elusive. Rumored to soften the veil of waking? Did it work? Hard to say, but nobles paid dearly to try. And in the countryside, little changed. The same grandmothers, healers, and night watchers passed on their sleepy blends. They didn't care about university debates or guild certifications. They cared about what worked. A field hand who'd twisted his knee would still be given comfrey soaked in wine. A child who feared the dark would still be tucked in with a sachet of mint and rose. A widow who wept too often might be offered mead with thyme and violet syrup and told simply, "Drink, then dream of him." And throughout all of this, there was music still and smoke still. And the flicker of stories passed across generations like lanterns. Because that's what this was, truly. A tapestry of shared softness. A mother soothing a fevered child. A monk reading by oil lamp until the letters danced. A shepherd sipping a strange brew under a sky full of stars and wondering if the moon really did follow him. These are the real stories of medieval intoxication, not tales of reckless abandon, but of gentle shifts. Of altered perceptions sought not for thrill, but for comfort. Let's pause on that word for a moment. Comfort. The Middle Ages, for all their violence and hardship, were also full of people trying to make things a little more bearable, a little warmer, a little quieter, a little more magical. And they used what they had. The plants beneath their feet, the songs in their lungs, the flicker of candlelight against cold stone walls. There's a kind of reverence in that. Not for intoxication as escape, but as connection to memory, to mystery, to each other. Imagine, for instance, a festival night where a grandmother passes a steaming mug to her grandson. He asks, "What's in it?" She shrugs, smiles, and says things that help you dream. He drinks, lies on a woven mat, and watches fireflies blink above the hay. Maybe he dreams of his future wife. Maybe he dreams of a talking goat. Maybe both. And for years after, whenever he smells lemon balm or hears that same lullaby, his heart softens. That's the kind of high medieval people often sought not an escape from reality, but a reshaping of it. Not losing oneself, but finding something hidden. And so, they kept brewing, kept whispering, kept believing. They carved sigils into door frames, hung herbs by the hearth, stirred mead with silver spoons and told their children, "Sleep well. The dreams are waiting." They lived close to death, yes, but that made them live close to wonder too. To believe in a world where foxes spoke in dreams, a rosemary soothed the soul, and the right prayer whispered at the right time might carry you gently into another place. Not forever, just long enough to rest. And when the rooster crowed, and the fire was stirred, and the bread baked once more, they returned, a little lighter, a little softer, a little more ready for the weight of the day. That, in the end, is what getting high meant to many in the medieval world. Not rebellion, not excess, but ritual. A private, earthy ritual meant to shift the mind just enough to carry you through the long dark with a bit more ease. And if you listen closely beneath the rustle of old books, the scent of dried herbs, the hush of cathedral stone, you can still hear it. A whispered recipe, a remembered tune, a breath held between one world and the next. As we near the closing of this drowsy tale, let us rest a while with the forgotten souls, the quiet many who never made it into the grand chronicles or illuminated scrolls. The ones whose encounters with altered states were not guided by scholars or monks, but by the rhythm of daily survival. Take the mill workers, whose days were spent amid the thrum and dust of grinding grain. Many reported dizziness, strange dreams, even hallucinations, not from herbs or prayer, but from prolonged exposure to ergot spores in the flour, which, when inhaled or ingested over time, could trigger effects eerily similar to modern hallucinogens. It wasn't intentional, but it shaped their experience all the same. Some saw patterns in the grain dust. Others claimed to feel the presence of saints while sifting flour. And a few, tragically, slipped into frenzied episodes that frightened their families and puzzled their priests. There was no term for neurological intoxication. There was only behavior and the stories woven around it. And then there were the candle makers, the dyers, and leather workers, those who inhaled fumes daily, who absorbed tinctures through calloused hands. The world they moved in was chemical, pungent, heady. Their nights may have been filled with strange dreams not born of mysticism, but of toxin-laced craftwork, yet they too found meaning in it. One journeyman in Bruges recorded that the smell of boiling dye opened visions of gardens where the colors were too rich to name. And what of the seafaring folk fishermen, sailors, traders, who spent weeks adrift under star-heavy skies? For them, the ocean was both mirror and medicine. Endless motion, the salt air, the isolation, it reshaped the mind. Sailors sometimes chewed sea holly, a coastal herb thought to sharpen the eyes and prevent madness. Others burned seaweed in closed cabins, claiming the smoke kept away nightmares. There are tales of sailors dreaming collectively, of mermaids, of underwater cities, of storms they said were sent by gods who lived in the deep. And when asked why they believed these things, many simply replied, "Because I saw it." Who's to say they didn't? Closer to land, herders and woodsmen often carried pouches of herbs, not just for scent or healing, but for companionship. A single sprig of thyme could remind a shepherd of his wife. A satchel of sage and cedar could protect a woodsman from loneliness or wolves, depending on whom you asked. One woodsman wrote in charcoal on a cave wall, "I sleep by smoke, I wake to leaves. I dream of no roof." It's not clear what he meant. And among these people, the rituals of nighttime became sacred. Not just bedtime, but full ceremonies of settling the body and mind. A candle was lit, a story told, a cup passed, the fire was banked, a window shuttered, the dog brought inside. Each act a kind of spell, a way of saying, "We are safe now. Let us forget for a while." The plants they used weren't always potent. Sometimes it was just mint, or barley, or warm milk, with a whisper of honey. But the effect was deep, because intention mattered. That was perhaps the most profound part of medieval intoxication. It was intentional, purposeful, and often shared. A wife preparing her husband's sleep tea wasn't tea making a drug, she was casting a kindness. A midwife offering poppy syrup to a weeping girl wasn't tea masking pain, she was holding space for healing. They didn't need to name these acts. They simply did them, and the world turned a little softer. Each night he would sprinkle a pinch over the bed he shared with his old dog. "It's for him," he said. In one forgotten hamlet, a blacksmith was said to keep a jar of sleep dust made from ground chamomile and fennel. But I think it helps me too. We don't know his name, but we know his ritual. And that, more than anything, defines this sleepy tale. It's not the wild highs or reckless abandon, but the gentle acts of intention. The cup steeped with care, the sachet stitched with hope, the hymn hummed beneath breath. The plant chosen, not for thrill, but for peace. Because in the end, to get high in medieval times wasn't always about escaping the world. It was about touching something just beyond it. A place where pain eased, thoughts softened, and dreams flickered like fireflies in the mind. A place that felt like a memory you didn't know you had. A place that perhaps you visited too. Let us now step gently into one of the last places where medieval minds sought altered states ritual theater. That strange blend of belief, performance, and something just a little beyond reason. In town squares, monastic courtyards, and even tavern yards, people gathered to witness mystery plays, morality dramas, and saintly visions made visible. These weren't just shows, they were portals. Music, costumed angels on pulleys, saints walking among the crowd, devils with cloven hooves chasing children into their mothers' skirts. The line between actor and apparition blurred just enough to make your heart skip. And sometimes, the players themselves believed. There's a record from a 15th century German troupe who staged the Passion every Easter. One actor, who played Jesus, began fasting, chanting, and sleeping on straw weeks in advance. During the performance, he claimed to see the Virgin Mary standing off stage weeping. Was it devotion? Was it exhaustion? Or was it the rosemary and rue tea he drank to calm his nerves? He never said. Others in the cast reported feeling light, open, emptied. One said, "When I wore the mask of the demon, I laughed in a voice that was not mine." These weren't hallucinations in the clinical sense. They were inhabitations moments when the performer felt taken over, not by madness, but by something meaningful. The audience, too, was not immune. People wept openly during martyrdom scenes. They gasped when a wooden angel descended. They prayed harder the next morning, or avoided the tavern for a few days. Some even claimed to receive visions during the play, especially if the performance was held after dusk. With torches flickering and the smell of frankincense in the air, imagine it. A child sees St. Michael slay a devil and believes it truly happened. A widow sees St. Agnes rise from death and dreams of her late husband smiling. No herbs involved, or no incense, but the ordinary. And yet minds opened. Because in medieval times, theater could intoxicate. The repetition of lines, the rhythm of movement, the communal breath of the crowd. These were ancient tools, honed by humans long before books or syringes. And when the performance ended, when the angel was unhooked and the devil removed his mask, the feeling lingered. A kind of soft afterglow, like waking from a powerful dream. That, too, was a form of getting high. Meanwhile, in the hidden folds of society, hermit poets, singing beggars, and wandering visionaries roamed from village to village, offering stories and blessings, often claiming their insights came from herbs, fasting, or divine inspiration. One woman, known only as Marga the Laugher, walked barefoot across southern France. She wore a crown of dried poppies and claimed to hear angels in grain silos. People fed her. Some feared her. Others followed her, hoping her laughter would pass into their own dreams. A man called Only Brother Low wandered the Welsh coast with a drum and a jar of wind syrup. He said it was for blowing sorrow out the nose. When asked what was in it, he replied, sage, mint, and a drop of thunder. These characters were often ignored by chroniclers. They left no books, no buildings, but they shaped their listeners. They offered moments of transformation, however fleeting. And what is intoxication, if not transformation? Let's not forget the seasonal rituals, either the maypole dances, the solstice songs, the wassailing rounds where people drank spiced ale and sang at trees to bless the coming harvest. Did they believe it worked? Many did. But more importantly, they felt something shift. A warmth, a weightlessness, a brief reprieve from the ache of back and soul. And afterward, they slept. Not always dreamlessly, but often deeply. In these final flickers of medieval life, we see how every level of society, from court to cottage, had its own way of stepping sideways into the realm of altered perception. And though the ingredients differed wormwood or wine, chance or costume, silence or storytelling, the purpose remained the same, to see what could not be seen. To soften what had grown too hard, to find rest, revelation, or just a little lightness in a heavy world. Because whether you were a queen with an emerald elixir, or a bakeress daughter chewing chamomile before bed, your desire was universal. To feel for just a moment that the world was bigger than your worries. And you so small, so tired, might still be part of something unknowable and kind. So now, at the close of this long, wandering journey through medieval minds and sleepy margins, let us settle at last in the place where all stories come to rest, the threshold between waking and dreaming. This was, and remains, the most intimate altered state of all. Every night, the medieval world disappeared into itself. Doors were barred, candles snuffed, the hearth banked for warmth. People crawled beneath wool and straw and waited for the drift. And as they drifted, they passed through the rituals we followed tonight. A sip of warm ale, steeped with lemon balm. A whispered psalm. The scent of mugwort in a pouch tied near the pillow. The memory of a chant still humming in the ribs. And then, like mist, rolling down a hillside sleep. But not just any sleep. Layered sleep. The first sleep, deep and still, followed by the midnight waking, when some rose to pray, some to dream again, and others to quietly think. Then came the second sleep, richer, more vivid, often filled with dreams shaped by the day's herbs, hopes, and fears. One shepherd called it the sleep of lanterns, where light returns to the mind in strange shapes. Another woman, writing in the margins of a prayer book, noted in my second sleep, I walk with my grandmother along the river. She is young, and I am not. These weren't just dreams, they were encounters. And whatever helped ease people into that space, be it song, scent, silence, or a sip of something steep, they welcomed it with open arms. Because in the stillness of those hours, people were themselves, unburdened by task or duty. They became children again, or saints, or wolves in moonlit forests. They danced, forgave, remembered, and they healed. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was restoration. And in a world full of aching backs, early deaths, and relentless toil, that restoration was precious. Which brings us back to the curious, cozy truth that for most people in the Middle Ages, getting high wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of care. It was lighting a candle for your weary bones. It was stirring a tea for a grieving friend. It was singing the same melody your mother sang, just slow enough to feel the sadness leave your chest. It was chasing a dream not with urgency, but with softness. Not to forget the world, but to make peace with it. And perhaps that's the greatest magic of all. Because even now, hundreds of years later, in a world full of neon lights and fast everything, we still seek that same threshold. We dim the lights. We steep a cup of something warm. We put on quiet music, or a voice like this one, and let it carry us. We look without quite meaning to for the old door. The one that leads from now to not quite now. From memory to dream, from burden to breeze. And if we're lucky, we find it. Through lavender, through laughter, through an old story told slowly, under breath. And on the other side, something waits. Not an answer, not a cure, but maybe, just maybe, relief. Just long enough to breathe, to loosen, to sleep. And now, dear listener, you've wandered far. Through smoky kitchens and sacred chants, through dream herbs and candlelit lullabies. You've walked among monks and midwives, saints and shepherds. And somewhere along the way, I hope the world began to blur. Just a little. Just enough. Because this story, though filled with names and plants and strange old customs, isn't really about the past. It's about you. You, listening in the quiet dark, perhaps with a cup in hand, perhaps beneath a warm blanket. You, seeking something soft to hold your thoughts as the day folds itself away. And what you found here, know, is something that hasn't changed. The longing, the slowness, the search for peace in a restless world. The people of the Middle Ages didn't know what a podcast was, but they knew what it meant to listen, to trust a voice, to follow it like a lantern through the night. So let this be your lantern. Let the whispers of herbs and hymns drift with you now, like steam from a cooling mug. Let the story settle behind your eyes. Let the flickering of dreams begin to rise, soft and strange and just out of reach. You're safe here. You're among kind ghosts and gentle memories. The world can wait. So close your eyes, if you haven't already. Breathe a little slower. And if a fox appears in your dream, carrying a candle and whispering secrets, don't be afraid. Just listen and follow. Good night. Sleep deeply and dream well.